Juliet moved to Lecky to escape her sadness, but she didn't know she was sleeping on a monster. The bed was beautiful, made of dark, heavy Iroko wood. It looked like the perfect place to rest. But as soon as Juliet lay down, the room changed. The wood didn't feel like wood anymore. It felt like skin. She felt a slow thumping beneath her pillow. Thump. Thump. It wasn't her heart. It was the bed. The mattress began to rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm. The bed was breathing. Horrified, Juliet screamed, "Jesus!" She tried to jump off, but the bed wouldn't let her go. It felt like the blankets were turning into arms, wrapping around her. When she tried to touch the floor, the bed lifted higher and higher toward the ceiling. She was trapped in the air, pinned against the wood by a strange, invisible force. She looked down and saw old scratch marks on the bed frame. They were deep and desperate. She realized then that this bed had held many people before her. It had listened to their screams until they had no breath left. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a trap that had been waiting for years. And now, it was finally time for the bed to eat. The humid air of Lecky felt thick, but to Juliet, it was the first time she could breathe without the scent of hospital antiseptic or the heavy dust of her village. At 34, she had moved into this apartment with a single suitcase and a heart hollowed out by a loss so profound she had forgotten the sound of her own laughter. She wanted a fresh start, a place where the walls were clean and the streets were quiet enough to drown out the echoes of the person she had lost. Ogre John, the landlord, stood by the window, his 62-year-old face a mask of practiced professional warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes.
I see.
He pointed out the reinforced door and the polished Iroko wood bed frame, neglecting to mention it was carved from a tree struck by lightning during a broken oath. "It is a peaceful room," he lied smoothly, his voice a half-truth designed to keep the rent flowing and the secrets buried. Next door, Sarah stood on her balcony, her nostrils flaring. She didn't hear the heavy thud of Juliet's suitcase, but she smelled the sharp, metallic tang of fear and the lingering scent of grief clinging to the new tenant like a second skin. Juliet didn't notice the neighbor's gaze. She only saw the bed. She lay down, her body aching with a habit of endurance, desperate for a sleep without dreams. She didn't know that the room was waiting. As her eyes closed, the bed began a slow, rhythmic rise and fall, a terrifying mimicry of a breathing chest. Fragile hope meeting a predatory, ancient stillness. Juliet awoke not to the sound of Lagos traffic, but to a silence so heavy it felt like water in her lungs. The room in Lecky, which had promised a fresh start, now felt like a predatory thing that had finished its meal. As she stood before the heavy door, the memory of the soft, patient knocking from the night before echoed in her mind, a sound she realized now hadn't come from a visitor, but from the wood itself. She found Ogre John in the courtyard, his face a practiced mask of indifference. When she mentioned the door's weight, he didn't look at her. He looked at the room's window. "The wood is old, Juliet," he said, his voice clipped and controlled. "It settles. It remembers where it came from." He handed her a small piece of bitter cola and a scrap of red cloth, claiming it was for good luck, but Juliet saw the way his hand trembled. Returning to the room, Juliet noticed the faint marks on the wood again, the handprints of those who had been taught to knock before her. A sudden, cold realization washed over her. The landlord wasn't just renting a room, he was managing a cage. Later that evening, a shadow crossed her threshold. It was Sarah. The older woman didn't step inside, but her eyes were wide with a mournful depth. "In this house," Sarah whispered, her voice dropping in pitch, "the walls have ears, but the bed has a memory." She handed Juliet a small bowl of white chalk, a silent warning that the struggle Juliet was enduring was not just her own, but an ancestral debt being collected. The shift from confusion to the chilling recognition that she is not a tenant, but a student of a dark lesson. The modern veneer of the Lecky apartment began to peel away, revealing a rot that was both spiritual and systemic. Juliet, driven by a desperate need for answers, began to search the corners of the room she had been too exhausted to notice before. Under the heavy Iroko bed frame, she found more than dust. She found a stack of old, water-damaged ledger books. As she flipped through the pages, the horror of Ogre John's business model came into focus. These weren't rent receipts, they were records of endurance. Names were listed alongside dates and a chilling column titled Lessons Learned. She saw names of young women and men who had vanished from the neighborhood, their disappearances masked by the landlord's smooth lies and professional persona. Juliet realized with a jolt that Ogre John didn't just know about the curse, he was its caretaker. He funneled the grieving and the broken into this room because their pain fed the wood. The Iroko, struck by lightning during a broken oath, required the blood and tears of those who sought rest to maintain its unnatural life. A knock at the door made her heart seize. It wasn't the soft, patient knock of the room this time. It was Ogre John. "Juliet," he called through the heavy wood, his voice dropping into a low, predatory register. "I see you are not sleeping. Why fight the bed? It only wants to give you what you asked for, a sleep without dreams." Through the window, Juliet saw Sarah watching from the shadows of the next balcony, her face a mask of mournful silence. Sarah raised a finger to her lips, then pointed toward the floor, toward the ledger in Juliet's hands. Juliet wasn't just a tenant anymore. She was a witness to a decades-long cycle of human sacrifice disguised as real estate. Horror at the betrayal, realizing her grief was being harvested. The humidity of the safe house, a small, cramped storage area behind Sarah's kitchen, clung to Juliet like a wet shroud. Sarah sat across from her, the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp casting long, skeletal shadows against the walls. "He thinks he owns the silence," Sarah whispered, her voice low and raspy. "But the silence belongs to the ones who died before you." Sarah revealed the forced proximity of their lives. She had watched tenant after tenant enter that room, trapped by the same humming wood and the same lies from Ogre John. Sarah wasn't just a neighbor. She was the sister of the woman who had died years ago, the woman whose unfinished prayer still vibrated in the Iroko bed. She handed Juliet a small bundle of bitter cola and white chalk, explaining that these were the only things the bed respected. "Ogre John doesn't just want your rent, Juliet," Sarah warned, her eyes reflecting the dim light. "He needs your grief to keep the room quiet. If you stop crying, the room gets hungry. If you fight, it lifts you until you have no ground to stand on." For the first time since her loss, Juliet felt a spark of something other than sorrow, righteous anger. They struck a deal. Juliet would remain in the room to gather more evidence from the ledgers, while Sarah would prepare the protection chant that had been abandoned decades ago. As Juliet prepared to cross back over to her cursed apartment, she saw a dead hibiscus flower left on her doorstep, a silent, threatening message from Ogre John. A reluctant partnership forged in fire, as trust begins to outweigh terror. Inside the room, the air grew strangely still, smelling of coconut oil and old rain. Juliet sat on the edge of the Iroko bed, no longer fighting its rhythm, but trying to understand it. She began to speak aloud, sharing the stories of the lover she had lost, her voice a soft thread in the heavy silence. To her shock, the bed's breathing slowed, matching her own heart rate, and the wood felt warm, almost like a shoulder to lean on. In this moment of vulnerability, Juliet experienced a warning dream where the ancestor appeared, whispering that the bed wasn't a prison, but a mirror reflecting her own refusal to let go. She saw flashes of a future that could have been, shopping for a home that would never be built and planning a life that death had stolen. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not out of endurance, but out of release. The what-if conversation happened in the quiet of her mind. What would happen if she stopped running from her grief? Outside, she could hear Ogre John's heavy footsteps in the hallway, his surveillance escalating as he sensed a change in the room's energy. But Juliet felt a newfound respect for the spirits trapped within the wood. She realized the bed didn't want to drown her. It wanted her to stop holding her breath. Love blooming through the memory of loss, and trust forming between the haunted and the haunt. The tragedy deepened when Sarah managed to slip a final note under the door. Ogre John wasn't just a landlord, he was the one who had broken the original oath decades ago. The revelation shattered Juliet's world. The man she paid for safety was the architect of the very suffering she was trying to escape. Worse, Sarah revealed that the room's hunger was peaking. It needed a final sacrifice to reset the cycle. Juliet realized her time was running out. The room began to distort. 1 hour felt like many years, and the illusion of escape grew stronger. Every time she thought she had opened the door to the hallway, she found herself back on the Iroko bed, the handprints on the wood glowing a faint, bruised purple. The terminal reality of her situation hit her. Ogre John had locked the outer gate, and the neighbors, blinded by his public persona, would never hear her screams. She was faced with an impossible choice: run and let the next grieving soul be devoured, or stay and face the monster that lived in the wood and the man who kept it fed. The world collapsing as Juliet chooses to stay and fight for those who couldn't. The following evening, the compound was transformed for a neighborhood association meeting, a performance of high society respectability hosted by Ogre John. Juliet watched from her window as he moved through the crowd, laughing with officials and posing as the benevolent patriarch of the street. Sarah caught her eye from across the courtyard, a silent signal that the time for improvisation had come. Juliet forced herself to step out of the room, her legs heavy like lead, and joined the gathering. She didn't scream, Instead, she engaged Ogre John in a public conversation about legacy and the ancestors, her words laced with a secret knowledge of the Iroko bed. She saw the mask slip for a split second, a flash of pure, cold malice in his eyes as he realized she knew the truth. But the joy of her small defiance was short-lived. In a whispered exchange near the buffet, Ogre John leaned in, his breath smelling of bitter cola. "You think these people hear you?" he hissed. "They only hear the rent being paid. And tonight, your payment is due." The terror of being surrounded by people yet completely alone in the face of immediate danger. The night exploded into a race against time. As Juliet retreated to her room, the door didn't just resist, it slammed shut, and the bed began to lift, the Iroko would groaning like a living beast. Outside, Sarah had begun the unfinished protection chant, her voice rising against the Lagos wind, but Ogre John was already at the door with a heavy iron bolt. The room began to sink into a state of weightless paralysis. Juliet felt herself drowning while awake, the whispers of previous victims filling her ears. Just as she was about to surrender to the darkness, she saw a vision of the one she had lost, not as a ghost, but as a reminder of her internal need for courage. In a moment of ultimate courage, Juliet stopped fighting the bed. She lay perfectly still, her heart a steady beat against the wood's frantic throb. The bed, confused by the lack of resistance, began to lower. At that exact moment, Sarah's chant reached its crescendo, and the iron bolt on the door shattered. Ogre John rushed in, but the room, now recognizing Juliet's forgiveness and Sarah's prayer, turned its hunger on the one who had broken the oath. The Iroko didn't strike, it simply remembered him, pulling the landlord into the same weightless silence he had sold to others. The devastating realization that victory requires the death of the world she knew. Weeks passed in a blur of grey. The compound was silent, the police having long since carted away the ledgers Juliet had recovered. Juliet sat on the floor of the room, not the bed, holding a pre-recorded video message from the person she had lost, finally ready to listen. Sarah sat with her, the two women bound by the shared trauma of the house. "It is over, Juliet," Sarah whispered. "You ended the hunger." Juliet looked at the Iroko bed. It was just wood and cloth again, silent and ordinary. But the price was permanent. Juliet knew she could never sleep deeply again, the memory of the room's breath always at the edge of her mind. She spent her final night in Lekki packing her single suitcase, leaving behind the white chalk and the bitter cola, but carrying a grief that was no longer a cage, but a bridge. Acceptance of a bittersweet peace that can never fully heal. 1 year later, Juliet stands at a memorial site in her home village, the air smelling of shea butter and home. She has established a small sanctuary for grieving women, a place where they are taught that some things do not trap us to kill us, they trap us to make us listen. She speaks to the memory of her lost loved one, her voice clear and no longer hushed by fear. "Thank you," she whispers to the wind. "We are living the life you gave us." As the sun sets over the village, casting long, golden shadows, Juliet offers a bittersweet smile through her tears. She knows she will always carry the weight of the room, but she also carries the light of the sacrifice. Juliet closing the door of the sanctuary, not to lock anyone in, but to keep the peace protected. Even in darkness, we can choose to be light. What did you think of Juliet's journey? Did the room's lesson hit home for you? Tell me in the comments what moment made you tear up the most. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to know their grief doesn't have to be a prison. And subscribe, because I have more stories that will remind you what it means to truly feel. Thank you for being here.